Hello, Daniel.
Hey, Vanan, how are you? Look at this space, man. It's a nice upgrade from our usual glass table.
Yeah, much better.
Yeah, thank you to producer Marcus. You've really come through this time.
Thanks, Marcus.
Yeah. Happy National Day to you.
Yes, happy 59th National Day.
Yeah. You have a nice long weekend?
Yes, I tried. I definitely tried.
Okay. Well, I don't want to ask you too much, but you managed to see the parade or anything?
Yeah, I did. I mean, I was looking forward to it.
Yeah.
First time that we get to see two new leadership in Singapore.
A new president, a new prime minister.
Yeah. So that was all really fun, really good. I enjoyed our new prime minister's National Day message as well. Daniel Liu.
Sure. Okay.
But yeah, no, all in all, I feel great. I'm glad that we are getting into the hang of things. Our next episode that we are recording so soon after our first one. For those who don't know, we are now the Local Politics, or Majula presents the Local Politics. No agendas, just answers.
Sure. What a tagline.
Yeah. So Daniel, before we get into the discussion of the topic today, which is about gerrymandering and EBRC, I wanted to congratulate you on your new title. It seems.
Thank you very much.
For our listeners who might not know, do you want to just
and viewers
kind of share or bask a little bit in your new amazing journey of getting this new title?
Yeah, I on Friday I was convened, I guess, a public service medal by the Singapore government. So I get to put the letters PBM after my name now. In some context.
Wait, PMD or PBM?
PBM.
Oh, PBM.
PBM, it's a short form for Malay term, Pingat Sakti. I don't misspell this. I'll mispronounce this because I can't. Pingat Bhakti Masyarakat. So it's the kind of like entry level of National Day Awards.
Oh, wow.
So similar to like OBE or something in the UK or whatever.
So what does that mean? When you go through ERP, do you now not have to pay for ERP and parking? Or?
No. It doesn't mean anything. It doesn't give me any privileges or anything. I just have a new title, a new set of letters I put at the back of my name. And it's really because of a lot of the community work I've been doing in the constituency over the last 10 years now. I've been doing this, so it's big honor to be honest.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think I know I joke, but I think you have selflessly sacrificed a lot of your time for community work. So congratulations! And I know when you get your medal, I'll convene your honor in November. I'm sure we'll talk about it.
Maybe
again. Then
it's a bit embarrassing, but
Sure. Sure. Well, now that you have won an award and you're officially someone of some kind of rigor or vigor or title.
Sure.
We can maybe hastily move into an area that I think you are quite maybe more aware than me in terms of election information.
I don't know anything.
Okay. But at least for today's topic, we wanted to talk about what was discussed in Parliament last week.
Right.
A motion filed by PSP and Hazel Pua on gerrymandering.
Right. They filed a motion in Parliament. It was titled Reviewing the Electoral Boundary Review Process. I think in short, it was a motion that was put forward to try and revisit this issue of how electoral boundaries are drawn before a general election. And I think on the backdrop of this, for our listeners and viewers now, is that it's happening again against the backdrop of definitely within the next 12 months to 18 months, we will see a general election called in Singapore. And this is, I think, going to be a very important election for us. Not just every election is obviously very important, but, looking at demographic data, this is an election where we would probably see the peak number of voters voting in a Singapore general election, because you have, the most number of people who are turning 18 years old and above, turning 21 years old and
21
above,
years old, yeah.
who can vote. And we're still at a point in time where not a lot of our seniors have, passed on, right? So as we are an aging population, we will see fewer and fewer people turning 21 in the next general election after this, or 2028 or 9 or whenever the next one is called. But more seniors would pass on. So this is going to be, I guess, a peak election. And so why this is important is because where people generally vote now will what people generally vote for when they enter into the voting age, they kind of carry that on.
Yeah.
The people do change, but it takes a lot more to persuade people to change from the party they start with.
Yeah.
So, bringing up any kind of issues related to how the election is administrated, I think it's in the interest of the opposition parties to get that part of the zeitgeist, right? The political zeitgeist at this point, as we move into a clearly blossoming election season.
Yeah, blossoming, I guess, is one way of looking at it. I think for a country like Singapore, where we've had the same party since our independence governing our country, this question about, is there election interference? Is there any kind of incumbent version of selective governance practices that promotes their own form of, having control over Singapore? These kind of questions will always be in the minds of opposition parties, but maybe also among residents in Singapore. So I guess, like you said, when the most amount of people in our history are going to vote in an election, and in an election where there's a new prime minister who'll be helming this, it's important to really unpack why this is important.
Look, and from my perspective, which is obviously a much more pro-party perspective, I think it's fair to say, two things. One, this is not the first time that the Boundary Commission has been, looked at politically or addressed politically. I mean, even earlier this year, WP Workers' Party politician Gerald Giam, he asked some parliamentary questions related to whether or not the commission had been formed, or whether or not, the Prime Minister thought that the amount of time that you had after the report came out was fair to political parties. But even, I think it's an easy target because anecdotally, you look at some of the boundaries that have been drawn in the past without really understanding why these boundaries are drawn like this. It's very easy to say, hey, this particular GRC looks funny, or, why is this part of Singapore parked under another part of Singapore? So it's an easy target. It's an easy target.
Yeah, sure. But at the same time, I guess, as we were preparing for this podcast episode, there are two conversations taking place, right? One is what the opposition are bringing as points of debate and structure in Parliament. And the another one, which is also maybe as important, is public sentiment and what, some people's views and opinions in this country are about what might be the practices that the government has, could be false, but a general sentiment around what they think could be controlling behavior around electoral boundaries. So, I think there's a lot to unpack. We've had a good time discussing in our prep for this, but maybe let's just lay out the facts of what this means, right?
Yeah.
What is gerrymandering? What is EBRC? And what exactly was the motion about?
Yeah. So gerrymandering, this term, maybe most people don't know. It comes from the United States, where there was a elected official in a state called New Jersey, and his name was something Jerry. I can't remember the full story, but he was responsible for drawing electoral boundaries that heavily favored his political party in elections. And they, in that election, they call it gerrymandering, and that has kind of taken form. But gerrymandering, in a sense, would be, moving electoral boundaries in a way that would give one political party a, objective benefit over the other when the election came, right?
Yeah.
And so the job of the EBRC, the Electoral Boundary Review Commission, is, to, on a timely basis, right before a general election, look at, how the demographics, both geographically and, mainly geographically, how they have changed in Singapore, and ensure that the boundaries that are used for elections are relatively representative of the way people live, with some like parameters included, right? Like ensuring that individual members of parliament, when whoever opposition or party, serve a relatively equitable number of residents, right? I mean, in Singapore, the variance is higher than in other parts of the world, but about 20% variance. But using kind of census data, demographic data, the housing patterns, and actually they also, I think they try to take a forward-looking view, right? So if they know that there are HDB estates that are going to be built in a particular division in the next year or two, then they take that into account as well. If it's going to be 10 years before the next, then they don't, because they review every GE. And so how it works is the EBRC, is kind of called at the, beck and call of the prime minister. He decides, but it's part of the election process. So you can't have a GE without the EBRC being formed and having a report. So at a time that, the prime minister decides, he calls for the EBRC to be formed. But after he decides that, there's no more interference from a political party, because why are you smiling?
No, I mean, I'm just remembering some of the discussions in Parliament, right? I before you continue, I just wanted to follow up on one of your points, just add on really that gerrymandering is not just not gaining an advantage. It's not gaining an advantage through interference.
Sure.
Right?
Sure.
I mean, in a lot of, and I think this is important for the discussion that we're going to have, because any incumbent in any government is allowed to have some kind of competitive advantage, but it should not be born out of the fact of direct interference.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, and I think that's what at least I think in Singapore we are trying our best to do.
Yeah, and I think maybe just to clarify that, like what that would mean in our context would be, if you think your town council is doing a good job, then they deserve to get your vote. Versus,
Exactly.
If you think your town council is not doing a good job, then it's fair to say, from a municipal point of view, we should, move them out, right?
Sure.
Yeah, sure. Change the party.
Sure. But going back to what you're saying. So the Prime Minister convenes the EBRC.
Well, he tells his secretary or a cabinet secretary who's a civil servant to convene the EBRC. The cabinet secretary, he chairs it. He identifies senior civil servants who are, more in tune with how demographics are related to Singapore. So maybe someone from HDB, maybe someone in urban planning at URA.
Well, not maybe. It's definitely someone from HDB.
Sure. I mean, who the members are, it's not specified, right? It doesn't have to be these 4 or 5 or 6 people.
Yeah.
But it has to be someone a committee of people who understand Singapore geographically, demographically, economically.
Yeah.
And they take, a lot of data that is given to them. They look at what the trends have been from a population shift perspective. For example, in the last EBRC report, about 200,000 people have moved from different divisions.
Annually, right?
Annually. Yeah. So, that causes a lot of interesting changes to the way the density of people are allocated, right, in divisions.
Yeah.
One of the trends, another trend, for example, is that Singapore today, we have a lot more public housing estates than we did 20 years ago, even though, our population size may not be that big. But that's also because the number of people living in HDBs per unit has come down a lot, right? So, for example, if you're trying to ensure that the same number of people are living in one electoral division, by de facto, the division needs to be a little bit bigger because there are fewer people living within each housing unit.
Yeah.
So they come up with a report on the new boundaries and they send it to the Prime Minister. Now, the Prime Minister can sort of reject or accept this report, but I think it's very important to state that so far, no Prime Minister has ever rejected the EBRC report or has ever asked it to make amendments. And why do we know this? It's because if there are amendments suggested or made by the Prime Minister, the report has to say what they are. So if we all kind of take the stand that, the process is transparent and everyone is, following the law, then we know that politically there's not much interference. There isn't any interference in the EBRC.
Yeah, and this is important as well, right? Because the EBRC committee, which will be made up of civil servants, as you rightfully explained, is supposed to work in the interest of voters and not political parties. And for Singapore, where being transparent has been a very important requirement for the way they govern or the way Singapore has been governed, it is important to lay these markers down quite clearly. So when Hazel Pua had raised this motion in Parliament, almost, maybe not directly, right, but almost indirectly accusing the government of gerrymandering practices. It was important that this discussion and this debate that followed on, kind of made certain that there isn't any kind of malpractices in terms of interference from political parties. So now that you've kind of given a nice overview and a good introduction into what the EBRC does, maybe let's just kind of look at some of the key takeaways. I mean, it was quite a lengthy
2-hour
parliamentary discussion, but just for the benefit of our listeners and viewers now, maybe like a quick, what we thought were the most important points that were brought up in Parliament by both Workers' Party and PSP.
You can say they're important points. I don't think that's that important. But for the sake of having this discussion, maybe we can I'll just share a little bit what I took out are some of the key issues. So Hazel Phua, in her opening speech from the PSP, they wanted to introduce some. I think what they tried to do is to introduce some seeds of doubt to delegitimize the process by saying things like, the amount of words that were used in the EBRC report, or the number of paragraphs in the EBRC report, have come down. So can the government mandate how much is reported, right? I mean, which I don't know about you, but you've actually gone and read back the EBRC reports from the past few elections, and from the white papers, and from a content perspective, it's quite okay. It's quite strong. They lay out.
It's quite light. In fact, there's not that much anecdotal paragraphs. A lot of tables, facts, and figures.
Yeah.
I found it hard to do comparative analysis of anything. But then again, it's a white paper.
Right.
It's not an analytical report. So for someone who's after just transparent findings on the change in population and what is the recommendations, it's actually rather quite clear. So the recommendations are the first 2 or 3 pages in very succinct, simple paragraphs. And then a lot of it is substantiated by annexes. So really, it was not that difficult to read.
Okay.
My only maybe beef with the whole thing is at the end of the annex, where there is an annex document on the breakdown of the electoral boundaries. All the electoral boundaries are circumdriven by the same red color lines, which you would think is a basic thing that the government can get right. But
sure.
For anyone out there who's listening, maybe if you work in the EBRC
use different
report,
colors,
use
right?
different colors,
Fine,
please.
Fine, fair enough. So, I mean, it was quite interesting. She wanted larger, more detailed reports with more public justification for boundary changes. And you read some of the reports, and if the justifications are there, maybe she wants more, I guess, verbiage or more prose on why decisions were made. I think fine, but I think more significant, PSP asked for a trio of things to happen that, in my mind, I just can't coexist, right? First, she said that there are a lot of odd-shaped boundaries in electoral divisions. And objectively, that's true. There are odd-shaped boundaries. And she said PSP recommends that all boundaries should be more compact and have a similar shape.
Yeah.
At the same time, she wants all boundaries to have, all electoral divisions to have similar population sizes, right? So we all know that there is a benchmark of 20 over 1,000 residents, and that can change by 20%. So anything between 20,000 to 38,000, I think you said it was.
Yeah.
Per division. And she also wanted that each electoral division can retain its own unique, local Singapore identity.
Yes.
Now, the point I want to make about why these things cannot coexist is because the reason why I think there are some divisions or electoral boundaries that look a bit odd when the boundaries are redrawn is because when people move out or move into certain areas, those boundaries need to be carved to reduce the variance between boundaries. And when you remember, like in the words of Kamala Harris,
yes,
electoral divisions didn't just fall out of a coconut tree, right? They exist in the context of Singapore's entire geography. Right. So when you move one boundary, by de facto, you might be touching 2 or 3 other electoral divisions. So it's not as simple as saying the shape should be a triangle or shape should be a circle, because every boundary needs to meet another boundary. So the odd shape boundaries, yes, they exist. And if you can say that they exist in a way that allows for the population to remain relatively constant from one area to another, then that makes sense as well. Then she also said, this idea of retaining an identity. Well, you can't retain an identity of a space. You can't retain the identity of an electoral boundary if you also want that electoral boundary to have a similar population size and the same shape as another size. I mean, there are many planned new towns or even private estates that have unique identities that look very different from each other with very different population sizes. So I think, in essence, my kind of big issue that I took with PSP's approach was, from a geographical point of view, from a policy point of view, the things that they wanted do not add up, right? It's not something that can be done. All of the suggestions can't be done and get to a fairer, better system.
You're right. I think, that's a good summary. I was hoping to, for some of our listeners who might, struggle to understand about the discussions around the shape and the policies around why we're doing this. I think it's important for us to kind of contextualize some of that discussions as well, right?
Sure.
Because as you are rightfully saying, we have to account for the different people who are living in these new towns, the different demographics. So the shapes can't be synchronized. You can't just take a line and cut through Singapore in 8 or 9 equidistant lines and expect that the similar kind of representation will take effect. There's about 2.7 or 2.8 million kind of people who are voting, and based on the discussions in Parliament, if annually 200,000 people are moving around this different constituencies, we have to account for that movement. We have to ensure that every MP has got a good burden of weight in terms of who they are serving, and that the concerns are being voiced.
And not to mention, NGE is every 5 years, and in between there are new housing estates that are built. Like Bidadari is adding something like 18,000 residents to Potong Pasir, right? In the constituency where I do more work, we will have 3 new, housing estates. That's another 7,500 residents, probably by the end of the year. And so all of these things are part of this whole process of redrawing district lines.
Yeah.
And sometimes forming new districts.
Yeah. For me, anyway, I looked at Pritham's message in Parliament, or his speech about this, and at least from the Workers' Party point of view, was that there has been active activities by the PAP that made WP's competitiveness in elections lower. He cited that in 2015, when Workers' Party were very close to winning 3 districts, when the new EBRC findings came out in 2020, that that competitiveness that Workers' Party had was taken away from them with the EBRC reviews. That was kind of a interesting finding, at least when I first heard about it, and I'm sure we'll talk about it in a few seconds. And the Workers' Party also, I think, agreed with PSP's suggestion for having a High Court judge to at least lead the EBRC's committees in terms of the work that they do and the findings that they were going to present.
They went one step further too, which is that not only is the High Court judge part of the EBRC, but for the EBRC report to be accepted, it's not just the Prime Minister that accepts it, but they want political parties to be involved, where political parties, both the ruling party and opposition parties, to have a voice in a say in whether or not the EBRC report makes sense.
Isn't that gerrymandering?
Yeah, no, exactly. I don't know how that would be operationalized, because PSP, the party that started this motion, doesn't even have an elected representative, right?
Exactly.
Leong Ma Wai and Hazel Phua are non-constituency MPs, right? And WP has now 8 seats. They used to have more, but whereas the PAP has a lot more, right? So how would you manage this? It would then again be in the interest of the opposition to say that, of course, the party with more politicians would have more voice at these meetings if there was a political influence on the EBRC report. So their suggestion to me is also not a feasible one.
Yeah, from speaking to friends, from speaking to different Singaporeans with different backgrounds throughout the years.
Two baristas
today, yes. I do think that if I was to play some kind of devil's advocate, which maybe I'm not, I don't know yet, right? But
try.
Okay, I will, for the sake of our listeners. I think people in Singapore might rightfully or wrongfully have this impression that the PAP, because it's an incumbent for so long, will try and change the rules of the game to suit their narrative. That when Pritham Singh, the leader of the opposition, gets up in Parliament and says things like, we almost won by in this election with 40-something% of the votes. And now you see they have changed it. Or, some people will say, when I wake up from home, I commute to go to work, which is a half an hour commute. I go through 3 different constituencies. Sometimes it doesn't even make sense. Or maybe someone gets up in Holland, Bukit Timah, they have to cross Tanjong Pagar to get to, another GRC like, I don't know, somewhere in town or something like that, right? So it's not as simple as that, right? It's not just about what the government kind of rebuts in Parliament, but do you think they have a responsibility to be more transparent, even though I think we can agree that the EBRC practices are definitely independent of government interference? But should they go one step further to make the report even more detailed? I ask this because when I looked at the EBRC white paper, the facts and figures are there. The tables, the annexes are well referenced. But the basis for how EBRC comes up with these recommendations, it's not clearly articulated. The details around these recommendations are not there. When asked about this or when questioned in Parliament, Minister Chan Choon Seng had a very good response to it as well, is that if you ask them to start to give a foundation and a context for every single recommendation that they give, then suddenly the report is not so easily accessible or transparent. And
it would take them like 5 years to do the report.
To the report. So is there a middle line here that needs to be balanced? Should the government take a lot of this, perceptions by the public seriously as well and do something to contain them?
I think politically the issue is that this has become a very hot topic that the opposition can easily use as ammo during general elections, because it sows seeds of doubt in the population. And from a political point of view, I think there is some space to rebut a little bit more clearly. There are, from my own opinion, as a concerned citizen, not as a party cadre or anything, I think there are lower hanging fruit that and missed opportunities from the debate last week. But I also, want to say that on balance, what else could Chan Choon Seng have done in this short period of time, right? He was responding to a speech that the PSP had put in. He also made it very clear that he was not the EBRC, right? He is the minister that is responding on behalf of the Prime Minister. He's the minister in charge of the civil service. So the actions of civil servants are under him, but he has no political influence in the EBRC as well. Do you want the government to make a law to say that the EBRC should be more descriptive in how they put out information? I think that's a very different debate because, again, that could also be interpreted as more political influence, not less.
Right.
Look, I think on your earlier points about what Pritam Singh, cited as quote unquote evidence of the EBRC being used as a tool to, subvert democracy. I think it's a very dangerous one too. But there are as many examples of the opposite, if not more, right? He said that there were a few divisions. I think Punggol East was absorbed into a GRC after 2015, and a few other examples as well. But, in 1988, Low Tia Kang lost with a very small margin in Hougang SMC. Well, the EBRC, didn't do anything with that.
Oops.
Yeah. There was a by-election in Punggol East in 2013, and the Workers' Party member won, Li Lian. And in 2015, nothing was done to change that. Choa Chu Kang SMC, 1984, there was another very close election. Goh Meng Seng, he's the opposition member. Opposition party leader. He lost a very narrow margin of 3.8%, and they didn't change that as well. I mean, the list goes on and on, right? There are many, many more examples of electoral boundaries that have been kept. Yeah. But I think the other point is, whether they're kept or not, keeping an electoral boundary just because the opposition has come close to show some kind of transparency is gerrymandering too. Yes.
And also, I looked at the white papers and, in the beginning of this, when we were preparing for this, I did think, are the opposition parties onto something here? Are the PAP, trying to alter the narrative for their own benefit. And then I looked at the white papers, and I found myself very quickly distancing myself from that kind of aspersions, right?
So you reformed?
Not as the party.
Okay.
But if you look at Aljunied in 2015, the Workers' Party won 70,000 votes, right? With an electorate of 148,000. And after in the general election of 2020, if Aljunied, the number of electors rose by 2,000 to 150,000. But the Workers' Party won 85,000 votes. So the Workers' Party won 15,000 more votes with the electoral boundary redrawing of adding 2,000 votes. Now, what the Workers' Party is doing in Parliament is questioning whether there's political interference in the PAP. So that like for like would be the PAP saying that the Workers' Party has influenced the EBRC because they have won way more votes after the EBRC representation, which is just not true, because when I start to look at the results per electoral constituency and the increase or decrease in the number of electors, right? So for Ang Mo Kio or for the SMCs or the GRCs, for the proportion increase or decrease in the number of electors, both the Workers' Party and the PAP have gained and lost about approximately a similar variation in percentile of the votes, which would lead me to conclude anyway, because I have a data head that I've won for the last 10 years, that actually the results are rather statistically significant. If anything, the share of voice in some of those constituencies for votes has been lower for the PAP. So if the PAP are actively, let's play out this scenario, if they are actively gerrymandering without us knowing or interfering in these elections, they're doing a terrible job.
Right.
They're not even gerrymandering for progress.
Right.
There's regression.
Look, fair enough. These are all very, sure. I don't know how to respond to that. Sure.
No, I mean, I think it's an important point to make, because I wish these points were made in Parliament by the government, by the PAP, who are the sitting government, because these are the important issues and key pointers that we need to bring out for Singaporeans who might have perceptions that are against the narrative of truth. I wished Minister Chan had come up more voicefully and said some of these facts out quite loud. I don't know whether by saying it, there is an inherent fear that you are admitting to the fact that you have gotten a lower share of voice representation. But having a first past the post system, I think it's important that you say these things out loud. And I know we'll talk about the benefits of the first past post or the regressiveness of these systems, but it is important to be kind of fair and transparent, even if you are doing the right things, and to be confident about those measures. And I think that was missing. I think the 2-hour discussion that I painfully sat through could have been a faster discussion. I think the point that you made, that a party that was not actually elected for government, who raised this motion in Parliament, and the rest of the members of Parliament debating this and actively accusing the government, the sitting government, of gerrymandering is a very dangerous precedent to set. Now, if a party is actively gerrymandering or interfering in politics, these things also will not be happening in Parliament. Right? So I think it's good. I think it's good and important to call these things out where it should be.
So look, I think it was a 2-hour debate. We're not going to relive it. I think the listeners probably, and the viewers probably, have a little bit of what happened and how we feel. Maybe let's take a break and come back and talk about how the government responded and how other countries might look at this.
Yeah, sure.
All right. See you. Okay. Welcome back. We're back in this beautiful room again. Well done, Marcus. Look, so where we were last...
Was that a shout out for Marcus?
Producer Marcus.
Marcus, yeah.
Look, so where we were last, we covered, Hazel Pora's introduction to her motion, and then James Lim said something, whatever, and then leader of the opposition, Pritam Singh, hello Pritam.
Hello.
Gave his comments as well, and then it was the chance for the government, CCS, to reply. We talked a little bit about it, but maybe just to summarize what was said, I think the key points are, first of all, the government is not EBRC. EBRC is an independent vessel. He looked into some of the suggestions that PSP had put forward in their motion speech. He was not really able to accept many of them. For example, things like having more political involvement that leads to probably worse outcomes. He wanted to reiterate that the EBRC does not use voting data or voting performance data as a metric when redrawing boundaries. And if you take, his word at face value, then it will come across that actually maybe the PAP in its position as a ruling party for so many years is too fair and too transparent, right? For some political strategists' liking. But that's the system we have, right? And I think, from this discussion of why the EBRC is important, we understand that in Singapore's context, it's really because whoever gets a majority of a vote in a constituency wins that seat. And that's how we end up in a position where in the last general election, the PAP won about 64% of the popular vote, but ended up with more than 80% of the seats. It's not a unique position that we have. It's what is done in all parliamentary democracies. So in Canada, in the UK, in Australia, it's the same system.
Yeah, India.
In India, yeah, sure. But you wanted to maybe raise this question of other forms of representation, right?
Yeah. I mean, I wanted to talk about the first past the post, but, as you're concluding, I just also wanted to say, because I think part of the reason why we do this podcast is we want to dissect the information that is out there, but we also don't want to influence a lot of, whether you have a right-leaning or a left-leaning attitude towards your policies. I think, if for those who listen to our first part of the podcast.
What does that even mean in Singapore?
Yeah. I mean, for those who listened to the first part of the podcast and thought, oh, these guys are all very sound, they sound very pro-PAP, I think that is exactly the kind of notion that we are trying to break away from, right? We feel that we've given a fair account of what needs to be discussed in Parliament. And, you have to look at the facts really objectively. I think just if you have the view that an incumbent should have an objective advantage to maybe, if you feel that the incumbent has an objective advantage to navigate their way through results, at the flip side of that discussion, you should also then consider that a non-elected party who's serving in Parliament has an incentive to get elected in Parliament. And in no politics I have seen that anyone who's in sitting government makes it easier for someone to get into get more seats in an election. So I think you have to weigh that balance before you come to or reach any objectifiable conclusions.
Although to be fair, I don't think many of our listeners would trust that someone who just got a National Day Award can be objective in this context. I promise I'm trying my best.
Which is why I'm here.
Yeah, sure.
But sure, I think you gave me a really good segue into discussing about first past the post system. It basically means the person who gets the most votes gets the seat.
And that's what we have here.
That's what we have here, and rightfully said. And when you start to look at the facts around the point that you just made, right, winning 64% of the popular vote, but then getting 80-something% of the seats in Parliament, is that fair? In the past, I mean, I've looked at different discussions about this, and there are academics who say that first past the post is the best of the worst form of systems that we have. But there are also critics who are criticizing it, right? I think in the past, when you've had two main parties, it was maybe more effective because then the parties really had to compete with each other. And there could be an instance if you were to really push the boundary where there are two parties and two candidates in different districts in Singapore, and every district was won by a candidate with 51% of the vote, and a candidate lost with 49% of the vote, which means if there are 10 million people in the country, 5.1 million voted for one and 4.9 million voted for the loser, then 100% of the seats in Parliament would be borne by 51% of the person who won the popular vote.
Right.
Now, this is an extreme example, but in general, all the criticisms around first past the post system is based on those, or based on this anecdotal reference that I've just given.
It's not an extreme example because the recent UK elections, the Labour Party, which now forms the government, they got less than 50% of the popular vote.
Yes.
But something like 70% of the seats.
Yes.
Yeah.
In fact, I'll throw some stats at you.
Oh, okay, sure.
The Labour Party, they won 35% of the vote share, but they picked up 412 seats.
Out of?
650 seats, if I'm not wrong. And the Conservative Party, which was the incumbent party, the Tories, they won 24% of the vote share, and picked up only 121 seats. Now, really interestingly, Reform UK, which is led by Nigel Farage, or Farage, or I don't know how you say it anymore, really. They won 14% of the share of the vote, right? So that is just 10% less than the Tories, but they only picked up 4 seats.
Sure.
This is important, I guess, because there is a conversation here to be had that the voices that are voting for these people who are MPs who need to represent and, you know, be the voice of the country in Parliament is not actually being accurately and fairly represented. If only 35% of the people have voted for Labour, but they command 412 out of 650 seats, is the general public really being represented in Parliament? Isn't Parliament supposed to echo discussions and topics that are of the mind and sound of general voters?
So I know you know this is going to come. So what would be the alternative?
Well, the alternative would be a proportional voting system. And I'm still kind of on the fence if I really prefer this or not. But a proportional voting system basically means that the parties who win the votes, based on the proportion of votes that they win, would then get seats in proportion to the number of votes that they would have won.
Right.
So if PAP had won 64% of the popular vote, then they get 64% seats in Parliament. And henceforth then vice versa and vice versa. But it's not as easy as it sounds, right? Because even in the UK, because everyone is aware of the rules of the first past the post system, people then gamify their vote. So if you know in your constituency that someone is definitely going to win, like in my case in Holland Bukit Timah, then the chances of you voting for opposition becomes a bit more in play. So maybe you don't necessarily want to vote for the opposition, but you just want to cast a kind of a scratch vote. In Singapore, we don't count scratch votes as part of the overall ballot. So then the propensity to vote for an opposition, even though you might not necessarily believe in the principles, becomes higher.
Look, this is a much larger discussion about, you know, another, I guess, kind of political tool that the opposition can sometimes use to try and get people to vote for them, which is this idea that, look, we're not trying to form the government, just don't let one party take a 2/3 majority and stuff like that. It's a very common refrain. But one other reason why, you know, I don't think right now Singapore is set up to amend this is because of how our town council system works, right? Because in each electoral constituency, the town council, which manages the estate, is formed by the political party that is given the mandate to run it.
Right.
So if we switch to a system where based on the percentage of votes, people are, you know, representatives of a certain district, that doesn't make sense either, but say that that's true, then you could end up in a position where, you know, the estate is not run by people who have your mandate, if that makes sense.
Yes, yeah.
So I think there's a lot more, you know, that is a Singapore kind of nuance, but there's a lot more in play that requires people within an electoral division and electoral constituency to vote for the people they want to not only lead the government, but also ensure that the, you know, management of their constituency, you know, it is nice.
Yeah, and you also don't want to overburden the MPs. So in 2015, the proportion for Singapore was 1 MP to about 28,000 voters. In 2020, it was about 1 MP to about 29,000. This is all on average. And I think it is important to try and maintain that balance. In the UK, on average, it's 1 MP in the lower house to about 65 to 70,000. And in the US, it's a totally different system.
Yeah, totally different.
They have the Electoral College. So Texas, which is approximately a population of 29 million, has 40 electoral votes. Whereas, you know, like Michigan with 10 million, they get 15 electoral votes.
Yeah.
And it's a totally different system. So we have to be really aware. I mean, in Parliament, the discussion of how some other countries are doing it was also brought into question by Pritham and PSP. And I think Minister Chan, you know, said it quite well that it doesn't matter if the UK or the US or the West does it in a certain way.
Yeah.
We shouldn't blindly adopt systems that might not, you know, be very applicable to us. And we should be really careful on what we're doing.
Also, if you go on Google Images and search weird-looking constituencies Australia or weird-looking constituencies UK, you find some really weird stuff too.
Fair enough. Yeah, fair enough. I think, you know, as I, you know, try to draw down this this nice discussion that we've had, the only way to be really neutral and the only way to ensure that the system stays robust is when you go and vote, be very clear on who you're voting for and, whether the people that you're voting for are kind of representing you, representing your voice, representing what you really want to, make your vote count for. And I think if every Singaporean does that when they go and vote, we can also be part of the system where it can remain independent and neutral, which I think is the best and the most beneficial system for all.
Great. So look, good episode. I hope people have a bit more understanding of what happened last week and some of the key issues.
Yeah.
This weekend is another interesting weekend. Prime Minister Lawrence Wong is going to give his maiden National Day rally. I'll be there at the ITE College Central to watch it. Yeah. And we'll be back next week to talk about it. Yeah.
To dissect it and discuss it even further, hopefully.
Yeah.
Just before we go, we are restarting this podcast and we've really liked some of the comments and feedback that we've got. If you wanted to comment and give more feedback, we're really open to it. But also, if you like our podcast, please share around your socials or tell your friends about it. We really appreciate it. So one more time, do you want to do unplug before we end the podcast?
No, that's okay. You can.
Okay, so we are...
If you made it this far, I mean...
we are Majula Presents Local Politics, and we would love to hear from you and see you again next week.
All right. Thanks. Bye.
Bye.